Hello folks, and welcome to our next video all about muscle fiber types. Now before we get into this, let's go ahead and review. We were able to determine the force a muscle generates. Now we're trying to figure out what kind of fibers are used to generate, because not all fibers, muscle fibers are built the same. So that's going to allow us to go into our discussion about muscle fiber types, and we can understand this by asking, hey, what sets muscle force? So we can review and say, okay, let's think of muscle force again as muscle tension, or the muscle being able to pull. You can also say it's the number of cross bridges attached to actin at once. So remember, a cross bridge is when the myosin is going to be attached to actin. And so if you have a bunch of cross bridges attaching to actin at once, what's going to happen? You're going to get more of the muscle tension or more of the muscle force because you're going to get more pulling. You need to be able to distinguish between a muscle fiber and a motor unit before we start getting into all of our details. Remember, a muscle fiber is a muscle cell, and it basically is going to tell you how strong each cell is. And how do we figure out how strong a muscle fiber cell is? We think about its thickness or its diameter. That's where we'll be able to talk about how strong a muscle fiber is. Very thick, large muscle fibers, then again, that's going to show you that that muscle fiber is very strong. Whereas a motor unit size, it's basically how many fibers are going to contract together. So we have our motor neuron, and then that motor neuron is going to have axon terminals that go onto the muscle fibers. And when you have like 5 fibers per motor neuron, we're saying, okay, that motor unit, it must be fairly small, must be used for fine tuning, fine control, like maybe an eye twitch. But when you're talking about larger muscles, like your quadriceps or your thigh muscles, for example, that means you can have hundreds of those different fibers, and so per neuron, because you need to make sure you have a stronger contraction with those, right? And so all those fibers that the neuron terminals are going to be on, all those muscle fibers are usually going to be one type. But we can use this information to help us understand how maximum muscle strength is going to occur when those fibers are slightly stretched and, of course, fully recruited. So we got to bring this all together. And first, we got to talk about 4 key factors that's going to allow us to maximize that force. Then we'll get into different fiber types as we go on. Okay. So first, what's going to allow us to maximize the force, and maximize the force of what? Of a contraction. You can also say that you're going to make the contraction stronger. Well, number 1 is going to be the frequency of the stimulation. We already saw that temporal summation can go forward to tetanus, really unfused tetanus, to help us be able to get that smooth movement, right? We saw that. So if you fire more motor neurons, then you're going to increase stimulation, and therefore you're going to have that tetanus or temporal summation, and you're going to have a stronger force. Next, we also look at the number of fibers recruited. If you have more motor units, that means you're going to have a greater total tension or force of that muscle. Why? Because more motor units, that means you're going to have more of these fibers for that particular motor neuron, and you're going to have way more firing. Okay, so that'll be the second thing. The third thing is, again, large muscle fibers. So how do we get these large muscle fibers? Hypertrophy. Okay, that means you're making the diameter of the actual muscle fibers thicker, okay, greater. And that's going to help increase force. Because the larger the fibers, that means you're going to have more myofibrils, and you're going to have stronger contractions. So the size of the muscle fibers are going to be important. And then the degree of stretch is really going to take us home with this. You can't have it be fully stretched, and you can't have it be understretched as well. It needs to have a certain balance. And so if we look at our overall graph here, we see the percent of resting sarcomere length and then the tension. So when you have your sarcomeres that's very, very short, that means your thin filaments kind of collide with one another. So you see the thin filaments are in blue here. They're kind of overlapping and colliding. So you're not going to get a greater contraction when that happens, because we need to make sure we have overlap between the myosin and the actin, not actin together. And also, if your sarcomeres are excessively stretched, then what's going to happen? You have very poor overlap with the actin and myosin, so that's not going to provide you the contraction that you need. But when you're in between 80 to 120% of the resting length, that's when you actually get the optimal overlap of myosin and actin, and you actually are going to have a greater amount of tension or contractile force. So these 4 key factors here, the frequency of the stimulation, the number of fibers recruited, the size of the fibers recruited, and the degree of stretching, to get that maximum muscle strength. Okay? And if we have the maximum muscle strength, that means our force is going to have a lot more cross bridges that are going to be attached to that actin. Now that we understand what factors are going to maximize force, let's look at how those same principles play out with different muscle fiber types. That means we have to focus on how fast a muscle contracts and how long it can sustain force before it fatigues. So that means we need to know how load and recruitment are going to affect performance. Let's focus on the small load. When you have a small load, like a small weight that you see here, yes, you're going to have the contractions form faster because it's going to be easier for you to, again, bend at the elbow because the weight is not that high, right? It's a very small weighted dumbbell, maybe like 2 pounds, for example. And it also means you're going to shorten further. So the distance is going to be very far because, again, that weight, you don't have any extra load or opposing force. It's going to take it a long time to get you all the way up to where your shoulder is as you're bending for your bicep curl. So it's going to make that contraction go faster and further. I mean farther, not further, okay? And there's different types of fibers that are going to allow for this small load and this kind of faster contraction. And these are going to be like our sprinter fibers, all in sprinter fibers. But technically they're called fast glycolytic fibers. They're going to contract very quickly and very strongly, but they also are fatigable, meaning they're going to fatigue very quickly. Next, we have our other type of fibers called slow oxidative fibers. And this is going to be more related to increased recruitment. So what does increased recruitment mean? It means that you have more motor units that are going to be activated. And so guess what happens? You're going to contract slower / longer. So when you have a slower contraction here and a longer contraction, you can be using slow oxidative fibers. And these are going to be fatigue resistant because they're contracting so slow, then they're going to resist fatigue so that you can have the full contraction happen before you go into relaxation. Want more motor units activated, what can you do? Use a heavier weight. So instead of dealing with the light load, maybe you're going to be using a heavier load so that you can have more motor units activated. Now let's kind of go through this here. So again, our muscles are going to differ in how fast they contract and how long they can sustain that effort before they fatigue. We have 2 different fiber types we're bringing up here. We'll talk about a third one next, okay? And this is going to be influenced by the type of fiber you use. Is it going to be like our sprinter fibers like we see here? Or is it going to be like our marathon fibers? Like we see with the slow oxidative fibers, okay? Depending on the fiber, that's actually going to influence how fast it contracts and also the effort, but also the load. If you have a small load, then you're going to have a faster and quicker contraction. If you have a heavier load, then you're going to have a slower and shorter contraction. Why? Because you're also thinking about recruitment. Recruitment means you're going to have more motor units. So if you have a lot of heavier weights, for example, then that means you're going to have to recruit more motor units to be able to provide that extra muscle force, okay? So you even have it seen here. It says the fast glycolytic fibers are going to be contractile. It's going to increase contractile velocity. You can also say speed. Whereas the slow oxidative fibers are going to increase contractile duration. How long? Now let's get into more details about these fibers. Because we can have these differences in contraction speed / endurance, that's going to allow us to classify these fibers into 3 different types, each with their own performance. I know it says 2 main traits here because we're going to start off with 2, but then we're going to include our intermediate fibers as well, okay? So we got our slow oxidative fibers, our fast oxidative fibers, and our fast glycolytic fibers. When it comes to these fibers, we have to think about whether or not they're slow or they're fast, and we also have to think about what type of ATP regenerative pathway do they use. Do they use creatine phosphate? Do they use aerobic or anaerobic in order to get ATP? So let's first talk about our slow oxidative fibers. Okay, slow oxidative fibers are going to use aerobic pathway or aerobic respiration when it comes to being able to get ATP. So that means it's going to have a lot of ATP that's being produced. And as soon as you think of ATP, go back and remember when we talked about ATP means you get to be able to have a longer amount of time that you're doing movement, hours, right? And so if you have a good amount of ATP, it can go for a long time. So when you're thinking of slow oxidative fibers, that means you are definitely focused on endurance. Okay? They're really endurance specialists. So if you're focused on endurance and you know you need a lot of ATP for this and you're going to be basically running a marathon, for example, which is why I call them marathon fibers as well, that means you're going to have a good amount of mitochondria. You're going to have a good amount of capillaries. You're also going to have a good amount of myoglobin so we can always have enough oxygen to keep the whole system going, right? And this is going to give these, basically these muscle fibers, these slow oxidative fibers, a really red color. So they're going to fire first, they're going to contract slowly, and then fatigue very, very little. So you can actually spend a lot of time moving, meaning hours in some type of marathon. Next, let's go ahead and talk about our fast glycolytic fibers, because again, it's easy to find one that you can easily contrast. So these are our sprinter fibers, right? These one again was our marathon. Now our fast glycolytic fibers. Fast. That means yes, you are using an anaerobic pathway for ATP. So you're not getting a lot of ATP. And because it's so fast, we know that, yes, it's going to allow us to prolong some of that movement, but it's only going to be about 30 seconds to upwards of a minute. So instead of focusing on endurance, we focus on power when it comes to these fast glycolytic fibers. So they're going to look very different. They're going to be large, they're going to be pale, and they're going to be loaded with a lot of glycogen, right? Because we need that glycogen to be able to break down into glucose and kind of keep the anaerobic glycolysis going, right? They're also not going to have as much mitochondria because they're not using the Krebs cycle of the electron transfer chain. But they are going to be able to provide massive force very quickly. That also means they're going to be getting fatigued really quickly as well. So think of if you have a short sprint that you're going, then yes, you're going to have all the energy you need for that short sprint, and then you're going to get fatigued, okay? So they're very fast at being fatigued. And remember, it's those glycosomes that help kind of provide some of that glucose as well, so that we can kind of keep this going up into that 1 minute mark. Now we have these fibers that are in between. And these are going to be our fast oxidative fibers. So because it's oxidative, that means, yes, you might be thinking it's automatically going to be aerobic. Aerobic activity, just like we saw with slow oxidative fibers. That's going to be the oxidation part, is going to be how we can connect these two together. But guess what? Because they're in the middle, they can have aerobic respiration, or again, they can actually have anaerobic as well, and just use glycolysis. So that's what's cool about them. They're going to contract quickly, that is still true, but they're going to use both aerobic and anaerobic to do that, and that means they're going to have moderate fatigue. Sometimes they're going to have longer fatigue, some is going to be, again, really, really quick, but it's kind of in the middle, it's kind of moderate. This is when you're kind of walking really fast, or you're like sprinting at a moderate pace. You're not trying to go extremely fast. You're not going to try to go too slow. You're like in the middle. That's where these fast oxidative fibers are. And the cool thing we're going to learn when we start talking about exercise in our last video is that fast oxidative fibers can become fast glycolytic fibers, and fast glycolytic fibers can become fast oxidative fibers, depending on the type of exercise you have. Because it's in the middle, yes, it's going to have a good amount of mitochondria because, again, it's doing aerobic respiration. So yes, it can have a good amount of myoglobin as well, but it's still going to have the ability to do aerobic respiration. So yes, you'll see some myoglobin, or you see a little bit of glycosomes here and there, potentially, because again, it does have a good amount of mitochondria that it's using. It's kind of in the middle. Now, guess what? Everything is not black and white. It's not just like I only have slow oxidative fibers, I only have fast glycolytic, or I only have fast oxidative fibers. No, most muscles are going to mix all three fiber types so we can balance speed, power, and endurance over time. And when you're training, you can shift fiber performance towards strength or stamina, depending on the type of training you have, which we talk about when we get into our exercise. Finally, let's connect fiber type back to real muscle behavior, right? Meaning how load and recruitment are going to shape speed, strength, and duration of each contraction. That's how we're going to connect this all together. Our load is going to set the speed or distance. Our recruitment is going to set the strength or endurance. And our brain is going to blend this together to match whatever movement the body demands, right? So let's go ahead and go into a little bit more details using our graph about how this is connected. First, we see that we have a light load, intermediate load, and heavy load here. And then we have a graph that shows as we increase the load, what's going to happen to the speed of the shortening, meaning the speed of contraction. First, let's talk about our light load. As you can see, our light load has a latent period here that's pretty brief. And then you're going to have your contraction and then relaxation. And when you're looking at this, you're like, it contracts very quickly because the latent period is very brief, but also the muscle is going to travel farther before it relaxes. So as you can see here, is this my maximum amount? I'm going from 0 all the way to 80. We see that that's going to travel way farther. So remember I was telling you small load is going to shorten faster, but also farther. This is what I mean by that. It's going to shorten or contract faster, but then it's going to also go farther before it actually relaxes. When you look at the intermediate and the heavy loads, let's see what happened here. The latent stage for the intermediate is a little bit longer, whereas the latent stage for the heavier is even longer than that. So we're looking at maybe 10 seconds for the intermediate latency period and 20 seconds for the latent period for the heavy load. So it's more of a latent period, and the contraction is going to be, again, delayed because of that latent period, but it's also very short, and it doesn't go as far. It just goes to 60. And then with the heavier load, again, you have your contraction. The distance is not that long, but you're also not going to have that contraction for a long time, 40 milliseconds. Light loads, you're going to have a shortened latent period and a fast and long contraction, okay, about 80 milliseconds. When you have an intermediate or heavy load, you're going to have a longer latent period and a slow and brief contraction. Again, it don't take that long. The contraction doesn't take that long. And we can see the relationship between the increase in load or the increase in weight and also the fastness or velocity of that shortening for the contraction. So here as we increase load, let's say this goes to 100 and this goes to 100 up here. When you have a very, very quick contraction, right, going all the way to 100, your load is very small, so you have a less of a load. Versus if you have a very high load, you'll see the velocity is very, very low. And that directly relates to the graph we see here. Now the question becomes, where does recruitment fit in? Well, just like we've been saying, well, what does recruitment mean? It means you're activating more motor units. If you activate more motor units, that means you're going to increase the total force. Why? Because the muscle is going to sustain that contraction longer with less fatigue. So let's get into an example for this information. I'm going to focus on question number 30. It says, if given the exact same amount of ATP, so the exact same amount of ATP, we're usually saying, oh, slow is going to have more ATP, intermediates in the middle, and then fast glycolytic fibers are going to have the least amount of ATP. But they're saying we're getting the same exact ATP. Which are the three fiber types? So slow, okay, slow oxidative, fast oxidative, or fast glycolytic. Which of the three fiber types will be able to contract for the longest amount of time? If given the same amount of ATP. So let's say 5 ATP for all of them. Well, you got to look at the fiber types and what they are. Number one, think about it. The fast glycolytic fiber type, no matter what, is still going to be able to do what? Faster and farther. So we know that this one's going to be the fastest contraction. And they want to know which one will be able to contract for the longest amount of time. So that's going to be the fastest. So if they say longest amount of time, I can take out fast glycolytic fibers. I can take out anything that's going to have fast glycolytic fibers in it. Now I'm down to slow oxidative or fast oxidative. Well, fast oxidative, we said it can do both. Whatever ATP is going to be using, it can be used for, again, like walking or sprinting or being at some kind of moderate pace. So it'll be able to use up its ATP a little bit faster as well. Why? Because if you are going to be walking or sprinting or some kind of moderate pace, then yes, you're going to need a lot of ATP to do that. But whereas slow oxidative fibers, remember, we're using our ATP for a longer period of time because we're focused on endurance. So we're going to use that 5 ATP to be able to kind of run for a longer distance, for example, doing a marathon or maintaining our posture, for example. So no matter what, the slow oxidative fibers are going to be able to utilize that ATP better because it's made for endurance or to last longer or to use ATP for a longer amount of time. Whereas the fast oxidative and fast glycolytic, no, that's not going to be happening. Fast glycolytic is going to use their ATP up faster. Fast contraction, fast oxidative. Yes, they can do both aerobic and anaerobic and get ATP that way. But because you are kind of walking at a moderate pace, that means that you're going to be using that ATP up a little bit quicker. Whereas slow, you get to take your time. Folks, I'll see you in the next video, which we get to talk about exercise.